good afternoon, or morning, or evening from wherever you're calling in. Welcome everyone, and thanks for listening in on this webinar, Make Pooling Work to End Pandemics. My name is Tom Buys. I'm a global health advocate at Wemos, and I will be the moderator today. The webinar is hosted and organized by Wemos. We are a global health NGO based in Amsterdam, working on making sure that everyone can realize their right to health. And as an advocacy organization, Wemos has a track record of over 40 years on access to medicines. And over the last 2.5 years, we've been involved in promoting policy solutions for equitable access to COVID-19 technologies, such as vaccines, treatments, and diagnostics. So today we will be discussing a report that was recently published by Wemos on how to make pooling work in order to end pandemics. It was a qualitative analysis of the COVID-19 Technology Access Pool, or C-TAP. And we will start off with a presentation on the report and policy recommendations by Senior Global Health Advocate Ella Weggen and the author of the report, Julia Hochberger. After this, we have a group of experts responding to the report. And at the end of the webinar, there's about 30 minutes of time for Julia, Ella, and the other respondents to answer any of the questions you might have. So if at any moment in time you have a question, please put them in the chat and we will try to get back to them at the end of the webinar. And please also let me know who the question is directed to. Unfortunately, Ms. Precious Matsoso, co-chair of the international negotiation body of the Pandemic Accord, could not make it today. And Shara Duncan Villalobos, the ambassador of Costa Rica to the UN office in Geneva, is not feeling quite well today, but we're lucky enough she still found some energy to present her response today. So after her response, she will leave us. Then without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Ella and Julia. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Tom. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ella Weggen and I work as a global health advocate for Wemos. I'm the coordinator of the consortium called COVID Innovations for All, consisting of KEI, HI, Pharmaceutical Accountability Foundation, Innovarte, Medicines Law and Policy, and Wemos. And we are funded by Unitate. We do advocacy and sharing of data, knowledge, and IP for products against COVID-19 and future pandemics. C-TAP has been a high priority since the beginning of the pandemic for our consortium. In 2.5 years after its launch, we thought it the right time for a research on the functioning of C-TAP and to see how a similar mechanism could function or function better in future pandemic preparedness and response. We think that open source technology transfer mechanisms like C-TAPs are very important to make sure people around the world get access quickly and against reasonable prices, and which improves sovereignty and self-reliance, especially in times of crisis. Therefore, we encourage strongly to improve the functioning of mechanisms such as C-TAP, and we conducted this research to make policy recommendations for national governments, the EU and the WHO. Wemos received funding from the People's Vaccine Alliance to conduct this research. So the reasons for this research is to make recommendations for the functioning of C-TAP and to answer the question how a similar mechanism could function or function better in the pandemic accord that is currently being negotiated. The relevance of it is that it's been 2.5 years after its launch, and to document its functioning and impact and to make recommendations for the improvement for the EU national governments and pandemic accord negotiating parties. The timing is because there are now WHO Pandemic Accord Draft 0 negotiations ongoing. We hear often that there are many encouragements of local production, and there's even a resolution, and there will be a World Local Production Forum. And we think that in the increasing of local production, we need well-functioning tech transfer mechanisms such as C-TAP. And we're also concerning the timing, we know that C-TAP will soon conduct its own internal review, and we hope that this report could contribute to that. We will use it in our advocacy for learning and accountability, to inform people about tech transfer mechanisms, to understand the interplay behind the functioning and impact of C-TAP, and to share recommendations with the WHO, the EU, and national governments. and also to inform or influence the WTO and WIPO, journalists, and other civil society actors. Let me see the next slide. Well, the research questions, which Julia will elaborate on after me, they were: which internal and external factors have facilitated or hindered the C-TAP to achieve its objectives? What recommendations can be made for optimal performance of a technology transfer mechanism in the context of pandemic preparedness and response? And research objectives are to document C-TAP's internal features, successes, setbacks, and missed opportunities and lessons learned, and to provide policy recommendations to the WHO, national governments, the EU, and parties negotiating the pandemic accord. We used as the methodology document review. We reviewed reports from journals, the unpublished reports obtained during interviews, and websites and publications. We did, Julia did 21 key informant interviews. They were semi-structures and included pharmaceutical companies, civil society actors, member states, WHO, UNITAID, People's Vaccine Alliance, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. We are, of course, collaborating, and we got feedback from several actors, for example, of the CIVA consortium, of the People's Vaccine Alliance. We presented in their communication and advocacy and lobby call. At the Public Citizen, we collaborated with Public Citizen at the Global COVID-19 Community Access Call, and we had a meeting already with the WHO. So this for the methodology. I would like to hand over the floor to Julia.
Yes, thank you so much, Ella. As Ella has just presented as well, one of the reasons for this research was to document the internal features of the C-TAP initiative, which is what I would like to start with now on the following slide. Thank you. So because all respondents have said that there's a lack of transparency both in the funding that C-TAP is receiving, but also the operational structure of the initiative, I wanted to create this visual representation to make it a bit more easy to relate to the information I'm sharing with you now. But as you can see, C-TAP is housed under the Access to Medicines and Health Products Department of the WHO, which is chaired by the Assistant Director General Mariangela Simao, but soon to be replaced after her retirement. And the C-TAP is then also further structured into the C-TAP Secretariat, the Steering Committee, the Technical Advisory Group, and also the Member States Working Group. Within this structure, the C-TAP Secretariat is the one in charge of running the day-to-day activities, setting the agenda for meetings, and also entering into contact with interested IP right holders and the negotiations as well. As you can see here, it consists of 3 WHO staff members who work on the C-TAP initiative next to their other tasks as well, so not full-time, as well as external consultants. The steering committee itself is comprised of various international organizations that provide their expertise and advice during meetings. Especially the MPP here plays an important role, as it is also the organization that enters into the licensing negotiations and signs the licensing agreements on behalf of C-TAP as well. And then there's also the Technical Advisory Group, which at the moment counts 10 members who work also on a voluntary and part-time basis and are a collection of all kinds of experts from different areas, such as technology transfer, immunology, and more. And they provide their opinion on potentially products that are potentially going to be licensed to C-TAP and whether this makes sense and what should be watched out for. And then you can see here as well that there are also 5 internal working groups that work together with C-TAP. These internal working groups are also usually comprised of WHO staff members who work also on other projects at the same time. In regards to funding, you can see here below that C-TAP is receiving funding from 3 main institutions. These are UNITAID, Spain, and Belgium. UNITAID was the very first funder and provided the seed funding also for C-TAP to lift off the ground, but that funding is ending also at the end of this year. And then Spain and Belgium also are the member states that are contributing financial support to the initiative. It can be said, and I think it's quite obvious as well, that this is not a large sum of money, particularly compared to the funding that other initiatives are receiving, such as Act A and COVAX. And this is also going to be a factor in the next slides that I'm presenting. But before that, Ella, you can go to the next slide as well. Thank you. I've asked all respondents also to mention indicators that they would like to use when determining C-TAP success, and they have named a couple that I've been able to categorize into normative, quantitative, and qualitative indicators. You can see them also here underneath. Normative indicators would have been that C-TAP in itself represents a new system for technology transfer that's independent of the private industry, which is the first of its kind at the moment. It's also creating both network and impact on a global scale and increasing the relationships between member states and their research centers. Most importantly, though, have been the quantitative indicators, and these revolved more around the number of in-licenses, the number of out-licenses to manufacturers, which kind and what amount of product is within those licenses, and how many vaccine licenses, especially against COVID-19, have been licensed to the mechanism, as well as how much product is being produced and how much product is being distributed through the relationship with C-TAP. And qualitative indicators have been the utility of the products licensed, but also the kinds of networks that are growing with publicly funded research institutes, and the increased access and affordability, as well as the interest of manufacturers in low and middle income countries. You can see here also there's a color code which represents the state at which these indicators are currently within the C-TAP evolution. So green is progress is being made and it's on a good way. Yellow is progress is on its way, but there is more to be desired. And red, which is the number of vaccines, is kind of the danger zone, as there are currently no vaccines licensed to C-TAP yet. And gray indicates that there has no data found on this, on the amount of product produced or the amount of product actually delivered to people yet. So in conclusion, the progress of C-TAP is acknowledged, but it's also deemed as slow. And I would like to move on to the next slide also to present to you the successes of C-TAP that have a correlation with these indicators. And so C-TAP has, in its 2 years and something of existence, had significant successes. And first of all, it's important to mention that C-TAP is a new mechanism. It's an independent technology transfer structure that does not operate with the private industry. And that's, as I mentioned before, a one of its kind at the moment. And a very big step also into the direction of growing the IP pooling and transfer systems around the world. Moreover, C-TAP has also already secured multiple licenses. So the NIH and CSIC licenses are product licenses to the C-TAP, and the Biotech Africa is an out license to a manufacturer in South Africa of the diagnostic test that CSIC has licensed. Particularly, these are very important licenses because they are global, non-exclusive, and royalty-free for LMICs. And this is exactly also what C-TAP was striving for in the beginning. So they set important precedents to show that it is feasible to achieve these kinds of licenses for C-TAP. Moreover, C-TAP is also supported by the 44 member states that have signed the Solidarity Call to Action. Of those, a few stand out particularly because they have supported the creation of C-TAP or have provided funding and licenses to this initiative. And moreover, there have also been significant partnerships that C-TAP has entered into with international organizations, as you can see here. And again, the MPP being a very important one in this equation as well. Regarding the successes, there are multiple factors that have contributed to these, and external factors would be that there has been a lot of very strong advocacy activity on the side of civil society organizations on the ground, both in creating relationships with intellectual property right holders and research institutes and member states, but also relaying back to the C-TAP themselves. There has also been member state support and political will, which has been the foundation for the licenses that we see today, particularly NIH and CSIC. And whilst not much, C-TAP has also secured external funding, which has contributed to the continuity of the initiative. Internal factors are also that C-TAP, whilst being housed under the WHO, also profits from the WHO brand or label that comes with this and its network as well, which does confer onto it very strong legitimacy of the initiative as well, and trust also as well. And of course, also the formal and informal support that it has gotten by organizations in the steering committee and also outside of the steering committee. Could you go to the next slide, please? So aside these successes, there have also unfortunately been setbacks and missed opportunities within the last 2.5 years of C-TAP. And one most regularly identified by respondents was that progress of C-TAP was slow, particularly in the context and impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. So there have been long waiting times in the contact between intellectual property right holders and the initiative, but also just a lot of very slow outreach as well. And aside from this, also member state support has been limited. So there are the 44 signatory states, but their support is also limited to a couple in very actionable activities. Member states generally have not been that supportive, particularly high income countries as well. And furthermore, by being housed under WHO, C-TAP also operates in a structure that is quite rigid, both in bureaucratic and in regulatory terms, and this has led to the initiative declining products that could have potentially become useful because they did not yet have regulatory approval. That's difficult because usually when products do receive regulatory approval, the intellectual property right holder is much less interested in licensing their products to initiatives like C-TAP. And of course, as well, we have seen that the private industry is not very interested in engaging with C-TAPs as a mechanism. They don't really see the added value so far. And this has made its progress, of course, also quite difficult. And coming in hand, of course, as well, with the fact that no access conditions were included in the funding and procurement contracts that were closed between member states and companies for the R&D of COVID-19 vaccines. And here again, we have identified external and internal factors for these setbacks. Again, C-TAP is a new and an ambitious mechanism, and these kinds of mechanisms do generally also take some time to really get off the ground. We would have liked to see a faster pace given the scope of the pandemic. But this was also furthermore slowed down by the fact that there has been limited support, especially at a high level of the WHO, but also of the media. So a lot of attention has not been given to C-TAP, but rather to other COVID-19 initiatives, which also then meant that there was limited support both on the side of the private industry and of member states. C-TAP also is a voluntary mechanism, which is both a benefit, but comes with its own set of obstacles to, gaining participation of IP right holders. And that has been difficult, but also on the internal side, C-TAP is generally underfunded and understaffed, which makes it quite difficult for this initiative to act on a fast pace and get a lot done at the same time. It also limited the advocacy activities and the contact and outreach with stakeholders like member states, research institutes, IP right holders, and didn't contribute to the creation of long-term strategies and operational structures. And so the initiative was working very much on an ad hoc basis. And the negotiability of the licensing conditions, such as global licensing and non-exclusive licensing, is not clear. So C-TAP is very much perceived as an ideal, which also scares some interested parties off. And last but not least, of course, operating within WHO means that you're operating within a member state organization that has very strict bureaucratic rules that comes with its limitations and slows down processes as well. And that means that C-TAP can't operate the way that some stakeholders would like to see it operate. Thank you very much. I'll pass back to you, Ella.
Thank you very much, Julia, for the clear overview of the research findings. I will go on to the policy recommendations in this presentation. We have made a distinction between policy recommendations to address the functioning of C-TAP, to improve the functioning of C-TAP, and policy recommendations to look at how a similar mechanism could be used in pandemic accord negotiations. So I'll start with the policy recommendations to address the functioning of C-TAP. And there we also made a divide between policy recommendations for national governments and the EU, as well as policy recommendations for the WHO. For the national governments and the EU, we want them to include access conditions in funding of R&D and procurement contracts to share with technology transfer and IP pooling mechanisms, such as C-TAP, to provide resources, political, financial, and human resources to C-TAP for its optimal functioning, to initiate pool procurement and collective buyouts, by member states of products and IP protected knowledge to license to C-TAP and other transfer mechanisms, to create demand on the side of generic manufacturers, generic manufacturing companies to become out licensees of C-TAP and IP pooling and tech transfer mechanisms. And last but not least, to implement incentives for participating in pooling and technology transfer mechanisms. Think of regulatory benefits, financial support, or fiscal benefits, etc. Then the main recommendations for the WHO to improve C-TAP is to broaden the range of acceptable products or research to include more non-approved products as well. To create a flexible and transparent governance structure, to allocate sufficient financial resources and more high-level WHO leadership for advocacy of C-TAP. And we were thinking perhaps an ambassador for C-TAP could be installed. To have another recommendation is to have more active engagement with member states, but particularly the member states that signed the solidarity call to action. 44 member states signed that solidarity call, but not a lot of them are actually doing something with them. They could provide funding or active advocacy towards, for example, national research institutes. And last but not least is to provide a model licensing agreement and an overview, including the cost of tech transfer. Then considerations for the WHO that we found and that we indicated in the report is to have C-TAP absorbed by the medicines patent pool or to keep it within the WHO system, and both have pros and cons. It might become less bureaucratic when looking at if it will be absorbed by the medicines patent pool. At the same time, as Julia indicated, the WHO is a name, it's a global institution, and it benefits from its reputation as well. The second consideration is to either focus on global non-exclusive licenses or more flexibility in the licensing terms. And if there's also pros and cons for both of them. The option to aim for licenses with a broad scope, such as global non-exclusive licenses, will mean that it has a bigger impact when they are global and actually resonating with the intention of C-TAP. But if there will be more room for negotiation and more flexibility, perhaps more private companies might be interested in joining C-TAP as well. For example, in a geographical scope. Then we have made recommendations to include a technology transfer mechanism in the Pandemic Accord for the negotiating parties of the Pandemic Accord negotiations. That is to mandate the use and support of a global tech transfer mechanism to ensure sufficient resources for the global tech transfer mechanism, to ensure affordable prices and cost transparency in out-licensing agreements, to coordinate national policies between relevant ministries, for example, the Ministry of Health, Ministry of Science, and the Ministry of Economic Affairs for increased collaboration of sharing innovation during pandemic. Another recommendation is to include transparency and predictability in the process of product selection and invention and in the timelines. And to ensure access conditions in R&D funding and procurement agreements, of course, which was mentioned before, through IP pooling, tech transfer, etc. And to enable an ecosystem which creates demand from generic manufacturers. So this is the list of the policy recommendations that we made for the Pandemic Accord. If you want to look into the detail, I'll recommend you to go through the report, of course. Then how we will be using the report and its next steps. We have had input from many of our consortium partners. We are hoping still to have a follow-up meeting with the C-TAP Technical Advisory Group and the steering committee members who are interested in the report to discuss more in detail the policy recommendations as well. We hope that the report can be used for the internal WHO review of C-TAP. We hope to be in contact with national policymakers and Pandemic Accord negotiating delegations, perhaps towards WTO, the G7, G20, and as we know, the there will be a World Local Production Forum in June 2023, hosted by the Dutch government and the World Health Organization, where we hope this report will be useful as well, since we think a well-functioning technology transfer mechanism is needed in addressing the issues around local manufacturing capacity. So I think I went through that quite quickly, before the time even, but if there are any questions already, I'm more than willing to answer. Otherwise, I will leave it at this for now.
Thank you, Ella and Julia. I'm aware that there was a problem with the chat function. I hope it is solved right now, and if not, we'll fix it as soon as possible. I would like to move on to the respondents in our panel, and the first one is Shara Duncan Villalobos. She is ambassador of Costa Rica to the United Nations office in Geneva, and as you all might know, Costa Rica has played a pivotal role in the creation of C-TAP. So we're very pleased to have you, Madam Ambassador, as a respondent on this webinar. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Tom, for giving me the floor. I would like to apologize that I need to leave, but it is very timely, this conversation. I have COVID, and this is the first time in the almost 3 years that I have gotten it, so I'm not feeling very well. But anyways, it is an honor for me to participate in this event. Costa Rica is grateful to be part of this panel and to see all the effort and the detailed analysis and recommendations that has been put into the report presented today. In 2020, my country, together with the WHO and a significant cross-regional group of countries, made the solidarity call to action with the clear purpose to create a mechanism that, through solidarity and international cooperation, would ensure equitable access for everyone, everywhere, to health technologies for COVID-19 detection, prevention, treatment, and response. At the time, we feared, based on previous experiences, that if a vaccine or any treatment for COVID-19 was developed, it would not be available to everyone, or the prices would be so high that developing countries would struggle to have access. We also knew at the time that no one by themselves would have the production capacity in the case of vaccines, and we needed to make technologies available for production as well. It was just a few weeks after C-TAP was launched that the announcement of the development of the vaccines was actually made. We firmly believed that multilateralism, cooperation, and solidarity would lead us to fight this emergency. But the experience has demonstrated that even though we have the resources and the capacity to produce sufficient medical products, diagnostics, vaccines, and in general, sufficient data to research, treat, and prevent COVID-19, inequity and the lack of solidarity and the protection of economic interest over human well-being are still a big part of the equation. And I'm sorry if I'm being too blunt. Nevertheless, we still have the conviction not only of the potential of C-TAP, but also on the possibilities we could develop if we would put human beings in the center of any action, international or otherwise. And that is why we're very grateful with the WHO and the implementing partners, and with the unwavering support of experts and civil society organizations such as KEI, the South Center, and others. Sorry. Regarding the report in reference, we share the view that the C-TAP has not reached its full potential and its progress has been slow. Somehow, there is a lack of understanding of what C-TAP is and what it is trying to achieve. In many discussions I have had since it's launched, I have heard arguments on how it is seen as a danger for R&D or as hampering the rights of companies and their investments, all of which I find as unfounded claims. Going back to the report, Costa Rica, together with the co-sponsors and other stakeholders, have worked to keep C-TAP visible and present in the discussions where we have considered it most pertinent. Among these efforts, we can mention the process of the negotiation of the international treaty, also known as the pandemic accord negotiations that you mentioned. And as you may recall, during 2020, member states from WHO had several informal discussions about the best way to address the sanitary crisis, but also to improve our response to health emergencies. These conversations led to the creation of the Working Group on Strengthening WHO Preparedness and Response to Health Emergencies, the WGPR. As well, the adoption of the resolution WHA 746 about the strengthening of local production of medicines and other health technologies to improve access, among others. In both initiatives, Costa Rica proposed language which afterwards was agreed by consensus that recognized that C-TAP is an appropriate, equitable, and innovative response. This has also been reflected in several resolutions of the Human Rights Council. So following these efforts with the creation of the IMB, we now see it as a new opportunity to bring higher commitment to the improvement of global health architecture and to ensure health is regarded as a public good. From the beginning of the IMB meetings, we proposed to include the C-TAP as part of the relevant stakeholders in Annex E, so that the Secretariat would be able to follow and provide inputs for these sessions. We are aware the conceptual zero draft represents a monumental achievement and a huge effort made by the IMB Bureau, who have worked to accommodate numerous political and diverting political and technical inputs into the report. In recent months, several deep dives have been conducted on IP rights or on how to achieve equity or to promote access to pandemic response products. From our perspective, efforts should be built on the existing mechanisms within the WHO to close the gaps and to build upon previous commitments and good practices. In this line, we believe it's pivotal to support clear language in removing barriers, the full realization of the right to health and scientific progress for all, and full transfer of technology and know-how for production and supply of pandemic response products, as well as their equitable distribution. We concur with the report that one of the biggest challenges of C-TAP has to do with having involvement of the private pharmaceutical sector and high-income countries. As I told you before, there is a need to address how misunderstood the C-TAP is and promote its principles, not only when we talk about pandemic preparedness and response, but also when we're faced with health emergencies in general. The added value of this mechanism is also reflected in its applicability to serve as a response for other diseases and emergencies, precisely because its principles allow for this. For example, in achieving, as you mentioned several times in your presentation, global non-exclusive licenses, to which many developing countries such as Costa Rica do not have access if we continue to do business as usual. Costa Rica believes the C-TAP should be strengthened. It requires more resources, more economic and human resources. It requires to be mainstreamed by the WHO, and its work needs a review to identify possible options for broadening its scope and transitioning into a wider structure for future health emergencies. We acknowledge the value, we acknowledge the value of recommendations in terms of developing capacities, including R&D, and implementing incentives for sharing with technology transfer mechanisms, creating more concrete information about C-TAP and its benefits, as well as bringing all co-sponsors together to engage progressively. Finally, and above all the challenges, we must remind ourselves that shocking inequalities on access will remain a reality that can only be overcome by collective efforts. Costa Rica shares the view that health in its many dimensions is a public good and a fundamental right, and we are called to promote and protect it vigorously. I know most of you here present today share that view. But my country will continue to promote and work for this approach to be understood. And we also hope the engagement and development of C-TAP or similar mechanisms will find their solid ground. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador, for that clear message and for still sticking with us while not feeling so well today. Then I would like to move on to our next respondent, Erika Dueñas. Erika works at the WHO headquarters in Geneva in the Access to Medicines and Health Products Division. And Mrs. Dueñas has a total of 20 years of experience on issues related to access to health technologies and intellectual property. And before the WHO, she's also worked at the Medicines Patent Pool. And we're pleased to have you. Ms. Dueñas, you have the floor.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to participate today. I will also say thank you very much to Ambassador Duncan for being here today, despite being so sick. And also for all the efforts of Costa Rica during all these years, not only leading on the creation of C-TAP, but also actively participating and leading the co-sponsors, member states co-sponsors group, and supporting in the steering committee so actively. So thank you, Ambassador Duncan. I also want to thank all the efforts from civil society since the creation of the COVID technology access pool and the launch of the Solidarity Call to Action, because these efforts have been in different ways, right? And since the beginning, we had groups from civil society organizations that help us at the local level, putting us in touch with some governments, facilitating discussions with health R&D institutions in different regions. So they also approached companies in order to talk about C-TAP. The civil society organized consultations, and they invited us to make presentations during these consultations. So it was really a lot of support from civil society organizations, and we thank you very much for all of these. And now with this report is also another way to support C-TAP and to support these kind of initiatives from WHO. So just for you to know, as it was mentioned in the report, and I mentioned to Wemos in our meeting, to Ella, this report has already been presented to the C-TAP steering committee and the technical advisory group of C-TAP. And of course, it will contribute to the current assessment that we are undertaking in WHO in relation to the next steps of C-TAP. So, and of course, these kind of discussions and public consultations are also very important for us to listen different voices and to receive more inputs for our process. So I just wanted to say that we agree with most of the recommendations to WHO and in general to the report. We think, of course, in some cases we're very happy to provide additional information to complete some of the information, but I don't have time in 6 minutes to go in those details. But in general, we thank you very much, and we agree on the recommendations and the considerations of the potential of these kind of mechanisms to promote timely, affordable access to health technologies. Of course, there is a lot more to do. Building C-TAP was a long and difficult process, in particular during the pandemic, while at the same time we're having different initiatives trying to solve the different problems. So I also wanted to say that, because sometimes I see some confusion that on the definition and on the role and the specific mission of C-TAP. So I think it is important to say that the COVID technology access pool is not only a patent pool, right? It is very important to always go back to the solidarity call to action, because the solidarity call to action is very clear on the mission and the principles for the C-TAP, right? So the initiative was set out as an alternative in line with other WHO efforts to promote global public health goods based on equity, strong science, open collaboration, and global solidarity, as mentioned by Ambassador Duncan. So, of course, it was a call for different actors. It's not just a call for technology holders to provide voluntary licenses, right? It's a call for governments first, for governments to take action to promote innovation, to remove barriers, and to facilitate open sharing of knowledge. So the work of C-TAP is also a work of in line to facilitate this kind of promotion, of course, sharing of intellectual property and necessary data to clinical data for the approval of the COVID-19 products is very important. But we asked governments to work and to do something, including, for example, through national legal and policy measures and international collaboration on regulatory practices or these kind of recommendations. Then we also, the solidarity call to action also calls to ensure that research results are registered and published in line with the WHO's joint statement on public disclosure of results from clinical trials. There were several requests and different requests to governments. Then it's also a call for funders of health R&D, which is very important, and it's part of the current discussion on the INB as well. To promote, the call to these funders was to promote that all COVID-19 publicly funded and donor-funded research outcomes are affordable, available, and accessible to all on a global scale through appropriate provisions in funding agreements. So this is also a very important part of what we're doing in C-TAP. Then, of course, a call to the technology holders to voluntarily license intellectual property, but also to facilitate data and know-how is a key component, and for that we act in close collaboration with the Medicines Patent Pool, the Open COVID Pledge, that are our implementing partners that facilitate these or help us, the MPP, with the experience in licensing, to help us to avoid this burdensome process of approval of the licenses, etc. So, and that is working very well with the MPP. So a call to researchers, to other stakeholders, to place their information and data on the WHO Global Observatory on Health R&D as well. So it has different components. So, and it was also a call in the solidarity call to action to patients and communities and civil society organizations to advocate for, facilitate, and actively engage in the implementation of the solidarity call to action. And I think that was, as I said at the beginning, very well done by civil society organization. Of course, all of us can always do better. So, of course, we started with COVID-19 because we saw the emergency, the need of these products, the need to have a global manufacturing, to speed up manufacturing, in particular where there was underutilized capacity to manufacture. But unfortunately, the results are also not the ones we wanted or we expected at the beginning in such a difficult situation like a pandemic. We see until now this lack of sharing from key technology holders, and there's such a big crisis, and that reflects also that purely voluntary mechanisms not always work, right? So we saw it not only in C-TAP, but in general during the pandemic. We're having the same problems for the mRNA hubs. The key companies are not licensing their technologies. There were some limited voluntary licenses for therapeutics. WHO keeps calling the big companies to expand these licenses and include more countries in the licenses of the MPP, for example. So there is a lot that can be done, but we fully agree with the Wemos report that has also other recommendations very important in relation to how to find additional incentives, or the one on access provisions in funding agreements. That is exactly what we are trying to promote with these discussions that we're having internally and together with all member states in WHO. We launched this questionnaire, this survey to all member states to talk about more incentives, because if we want more sharing, we should explore all these mechanisms, and it's not only in the hands of the WHO Secretariat to provide mechanisms. We know that member states can also provide that. We have an interesting analysis after, and a literature review in relation to these incentives that will be published hopefully before the end of the year. And this will contribute to continue the discussions. And the same on access provisions in funding agreements. Many experts that are in the call here today participating in the several consultations we organized in relation to these access provisions in funding agreements. And we have a document that will be published as well, and we are also thinking in continue the research and the assessment and the recommendations in relation to that in general in WHO. So all these conditions, we fully agree with the Wemos report that all these conditions to public investment to ensure access for all are fundamental. This goes even beyond voluntary licenses. And this was linked also or discussed with the pandemic accord. I thought Precious was going to talk more about that, but C-TAP is going to present, of course, the documents that I mentioned on incentives and on access provisions to the INB, and we're participating as well in the INB. So the experience of the C-TAP mechanisms in relation to that will definitely provide inputs for the INB negotiations. And I participated already in these groups, as some of you did, probably on the equity, on the intellectual property one, and both issues on incentives and these access provisions and conditions and access policies were already discussed there. So finally, just to update you very quickly on the C-TAP negotiations, to tell you that we are about to announce other agreements in C-TAP, 2 on vaccines, one with a public organization, institution, another with a private company for a product that has been already been approved. So those are important negotiations that we hope we'll be able to announce very soon. There are more or less with the same terms and conditions that were agreed in the previous C-TAP licenses. And we are also in discussions with other 2 in vitro diagnostic manufacturers, again, one public and another private one. So we hope we will be able to announce this very soon. So I think I'm going to stop here, and thank you very much for inviting me today.
Thank you very much, Ms. Dueñas. Yeah, and thank you for reminding us that it was also a call to governments and other funders of research and development to remove barriers that would hinder global access to COVID-19 technologies, and for the update you shared latest on the upcoming licensing agreements. Then I would like to move on to our next respondent, James Love. He is a director at Knowledge Ecology International, or KEI. Mr. Love has proposed a multitude of solutions aiming at making knowledge a public good. And KEI has been one of the driving forces advocating for the sharing of technology and pooling of IP. James, floor is yours. You're still muted, James. Yes.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you for that introduction. You know, first I'd like to say that it's been great that Wemos has spent so much time and done such a thorough job on its evaluation and discussion of the C-TAP, and I think that's raised its profile. So I would like to just mention that. And then Erika indicated there may be some new licenses agreements coming out is very welcome news. And I look forward to learning more about those. I'm going to I'm going to talk, I think, initially about things that we think went wrong with C-TAP. And I just don't want to take it in the wrong way. I mean, it's, obviously a lot of us are in early 2020, more than 2.5 or roughly 2.5 years ago, when C-TAP was first proposed by the WHO, following this proposal by the president and the Minister of Health in Costa Rica. There were hopes that it would be more important in terms of the rollout of vaccines and therapeutics, diagnostic tests, and other technologies for COVID-19. And it really wasn't. So in that vein, I want to focus on things that we think, in retrospect, could have been done differently or should be done differently going forward. First, I want to mention that there appear to be, in the implementation of C-TAP, a rather ad hoc standard for accepting technology. There are some technologies offered, for example, from Spain and from the United States, that were more in the nature of upstream technologies as opposed to final products. And I think that was the right decision. On the other hand, some of the companies that have that came to C-TAP to offer technology were really turned away, and that was just really we thought unfortunate. One group that we work with a fair amount is the people that were developing vaccines in cooperation with other countries, or not countries, but in some cases governments, but in other cases companies located in developing countries. And that was the group at Baylor University that was developing vaccine technology. And even though there was multiple efforts to, and maybe this is one that's coming through, to enter into some kind of agreement with C-TAP to formalize what the sharing agreement would be for the know-how and other types of the technology transfer process related to this vaccine. There was just not much interest in WHO in moving this forward, or at least it seemed that way from the outside. And I had this similar experience in talking with a vaccine manufacturer in Australia that was working in Iran. This was mentioned by Wemos in the very beginning of the webinar, that if you wait till the very end when something's through the FDA and the European Medicines Agency or something like that, it's very difficult at that point. The vaccines for COVID-19 and the therapeutics are now among the most profitable products on an annualized revenue basis in the history of the pharmaceutical industry. So it's pretty hard at that point to kind of do your licensing. So we would have preferred if they would have had a more a more openness to licensing things that were more upstream at the beginning. Secondly, we had wanted to see model agreements. If you look at the letter, for example, from the president of Costa Rica that was sent to the WHO on the, I think it was the 23rd of March. They asked the WHO, and I just read from the letter, to develop an initial concise memorandum of understanding on the intent to share rights and technologies funded by the public sector and other relevant actors, and reach out to WHO member states, nonprofit institutions, industry, and others to sign such an MOU. Now, I know that there's been work on this, but we are, I put in the chat the text from the letter from the president and the Minister of Health in Costa Rica in March 2020, just to highlight, specifically what this request was. I mean, we're really almost in 2024 right now. And so, not 2024, pardon me, 2023. I don't want to jump ahead here too much, but you know, we're all, you know, basically about 3 years into the pandemic, and we're still looking for that. Now, I think these, if you look at some models for licensing, like say, take the Creative Commons licensing approach. They have standardized licenses, which you can then approach people and say, will you sign, or will you not, you know, will you not sign a standardized Creative Commons license? And you don't have to enter into an entire negotiation about the license at that point. It's just kind of a binary decision whether you're kind of in or out. It makes it easier for groups like ours or others, like People's Vaccine Alliance or others campaigning on things, to push people towards something. Now, the Medicines Patent Pool is the opposite example. Some of the licenses are almost 100 pages long, and they're complicated. So I'm not saying it was necessarily possible, but some broad contours. I think if you look at the letter from Costa Rica, they were talking about a memorandum of understanding which provides some high level principles and a path to making into an agreement. So you could get this could be like a one-page document. You could have gotten, I think, more progress on getting an agreement on some basic principles of access to government-funded, foundation-funded, CEPI-funded, whatever things, if something like that had been out the door sooner. In fact, by March, a lot of the U.S. government money for COVID development hadn't even really been spent at that point. And governments around the world were throwing money at that point at COVID technology, but they didn't have anything to point to. Now, in the U.S. law, it makes a big difference if you have an agreement that you can point to with an international body that would allow us to put provisions in licenses which would go beyond what the normal rights you get from funding technology. I'll just explain that one more time. If the United States, for example, and I think other governments that we're familiar with have similar agreements, if we fund technology, we're allowed, or actually required in some cases, to get certain rights, their public interest rights in the technology we fund. Now, under the Bayh-Dole Act in the United States, they're limited, but you know they're mandatory rights that are assigned in a set of rights that you can get for government-funded technology. There's exceptions that you can pursue, but one of the most important exceptions is if there is an agreement between the United States government and some international body, you can reference that in the licenses without having to trigger other more complicated exceptions which exist in law. So you can't expand the public rights in these U.S. contracts if they're done under the Bayh-Dole Act in the absence of an agreement. You have to have agreement in place. And we've discussed this numerous times, not only with C-TAP and the WHO, but for many years we've discussed this with the Medicines Patent Pool, how important it would be to have some agreement between the U.S. government, for example, and either C-TAP or the Medicines Patent Pool or the WHO, just in terms of what our national law is. And I'm familiar with the fact that this is also the case in some other national laws. So we were frustrated by the fact that we didn't see these memorandums of understanding happening. Secondly, there was no regular press briefings or transparency of the negotiations. Now, in contrast, COVAX, I think you had big debates about, you know, what countries are joining COVAX, what countries are not joining COVAX, how much money are they putting together, and things like that. And they were more kind of putting themselves out there, and that made COVAX more subject to criticism, and they were more accountable. People were really critical of COVAX. I mean, you know, almost every group I know that's working with really complained about the fact that COVAX, for example, focused too much of its energy on production in one country initially, India.
James, can I ask you to round off your...
Well, yeah, I'm sorry if I'm taking too much time.
No worries, no worries.
But just give me a few more minutes to wrap this up here.
Yes.
The figurehead for the MPP or COVAX were, I think, kind of, to some extent, kind of identified. But one of the problems you had, I think, with C-TAP is that it wasn't completely obvious to everyone who the main point of contact was in C-TAP. Was it Erika? Was it Mariangela? Was it Tito? I mean, who was it? But also, if you have a mixed mission, if part of your job is to break patents and the other part of your job is to license voluntarily patents, it can really make your job more difficult. Now, the MPP, for example, does not get involved in compulsory licensing cases or uses of other exceptions. They just focus on voluntary license, not because they don't think the other things are important, just because they don't think they can do both things at the same time. And I think that's something you have to consider. I think there's, we pointed out in a number of cases that we think there should be incentives for people to join C-TAP. And one of the incentives that we talked about that we think is important is if you can't get countries to join or governments unilaterally to just jump into the pool and share with the world what they fund in the absence of other countries also sharing what they have, that you should consider this as more of a share and share alike model, where you would, instead of making things necessarily always the default being a global public good, you give the option of something being a so-called club good, which is to say that if you shared technology, it would be available not to the whole world, but it would be to other countries which made a similar commitment to share the technology. And I think that needs to be explored, because I think the incentive thing, you really have to look at that, particularly for C-TAP. But also there's lessons for people working on the pandemic treaty negotiations. They have to figure out how to make these things actually work. And the last thing I'll say is that there could have been better messaging to patent holders and to governments that if they put their technology into the pool, it would not necessarily be royalty-free gift to the world, that it was okay to have royalty-bearing licenses in the pool. Now, the medicines patent pool, most of the licenses are royalty-bearing. And I think that's would be been a positive thing to have messaged a bit more clearly about what the nature of the pool was. Now, you want me to stop, so I will. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. And I'm sure there's plenty of time also to elaborate on some of the comments you made during the Q&A session that will follow after our final respondent. And our final respondent is Ellen Hoon. She's Director of Medicines Law and Policy, which provides legal and policy analysis to governments, NGO, multilateral organizations in order to promote access to medicines. Ms. Hoon was the first executive director of the Medicines Patent Pool, which was co-founded by Unitate, and she's been working on the interplay of IP and access to medicine since the 90s. So Ellen, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom. I hope you can hear me
yes,
loud and clear.
We can.
I'm speaking to you from cold Amsterdam. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to comment, to make a few comments in this seminar. I would like to start with congratulating you for the report, because I think the report is excellent, but also timely and very, very useful, not only to look back, but actually to look forward. And I'll come back to that in a minute. I would also like to congratulate Costa Rica, that has shown very early on in the pandemic a tremendous leadership in proposing and advocating very forcefully and very successfully for the establishment of C-TAP. And without that country leadership, C-TAP would not have happened to begin with. Now, I want to first list a few things that went wrong, and then look at what the opportunities are. I think in the beginning of the pandemic, the expectations that things would be arranged in a very different manner, that it would not be business as usual, were very high. There was a lot of political promising going on, that vaccines would be public good and that things would be shared and that no one would own the vaccine. Great political statements that were never given hands and feet. But that, against that background, I think the expectations of C-TAP were fairly high. But what did not, a couple of things that should have happened did not happen. That is, countries started to spend vast amounts of public financing on the development of pandemic countermeasures, in particular the vaccines, and make market commitments and provide direct financing for the research and development. But that financing did not come with strings attached. That would have been the moment to indeed work towards this objective of vaccines as a global good, to say, here's the public money. It is meant to address this huge public health crisis. And when this leads to products and know-how, they cannot be appropriated. They cannot be private products. We then have to beg you to share with us, which is what in fact has happened. So that is one thing that went wrong. The other thing that went wrong is that this establishment of these various initiatives that competed instead of collaborated. I've never understood why C-TAP was not part of COVAX from day one. That would have been the most logical, logical thing to happen. Instead, it sort of became the ill-nourished little sister of COVAX, while it should have been an integral part of the COVAX initiative. And what happened with COVAX is, again, that was a promise of solidarity. The ambassador talked about solidarity, very, very important principle. But COVAX turned from a promise of solidarity to a more charitable initiative that had great difficulty also getting access to sufficient materials, including vaccines. So, but I would actually like to make the statement that C-TAP has been a success, considering that it has not operated that long. And what we have seen, and I was very pleased with Erika's announcement that more agreements are about to be announced, the actors that have come forward to work with C-TAP show us, I think, the way forward, because all of them have been public institutions. And I think that is the way to look towards the future. And here, the role of the pandemic treaty that is being negotiated as we speak will become very important, because of course, sorting all of this out in the middle of a global health crisis, that has proven to be a huge challenge. That was very difficult. I think the key lesson that we've learned over the last 2.5 years is that you actually need to have these things arranged up front, not when the global health crisis hits. So if countries can agree to sufficient financing for research and development for pandemic countermeasures for the next time around, and in between health crises, this financing conditioned on the sharing on reasonable grounds, and I fully agree with Jamie on his point with regard to royalties, the sharing of the know-how and the sharing of the technology that is developed for the purpose of addressing the global health crisis, and that is a commitment up front. That is not something you need to then start to haggle about when the problems start. That would be I think a very important outcome in the pandemic treaty. And clearly, public research institutions, and many of them are now being strengthened in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. These public research institutions will play a very important role. And I think that there's an opportunity to actually get in licensing to something like C-TAP, even before next health crises meet. That should become the norm, not something you have to battle about when the world is dealing with enormous problems. So I see huge potential for the future. There are many lessons to be learned. I think focusing on more upstream technologies. There's nothing wrong with that, and WHO needs to clear away some of the obstacles that it has experienced in doing so. The norm has to be the sharing of the technology. The norm also has to include sufficient financing to make sure that those innovations can take place, but they need to be developed as global public goods. And I think that the C-TAP and the future of C-TAP will be in being part of the mechanism that will be necessary to make that happen. And with that, Tom, I hand back to you. Over.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Ellen. Then we arrive at the final part of the webinar, which is the questions and answers. So if anyone has a question, please put them in the chat. If everything goes well, it should be functioning as it should. Maybe I'll start off with the first question to Ella, as I don't see any other question in the chat yet. Yeah, a question to Ella. So you've presented quite a lot of recommendations today, together also with Julia. But from all the recommendations, which one do you think should have the priority, or which one do you consider to be the low-hanging fruit, and why?
Well, I think I actually echo what Ellen just said on that. The priority should be conditioning public funding. There have been such huge amount of public funding going on from the onset of this pandemic. SOMO did a research on that for the Dutch government, but also we know that worldwide government invested 93 billion euros in COVID at the time. And I think there we should really think differently and set access conditions relating to the sharing of technology and data and IP. The low-hanging fruit for C-TAP at the moment, I would say, could be to encourage the signatories of the Solidarity Call to Action, the 44 member states that have been at the launch of C-TAP, to invite them to actively encourage and actively pursue their public research institutions, which are funded with public funding, to share the knowledge and IP and data with C-TAP, because that is an easy step, so to say. So these are my two main recommendations, but of course there are many more, and I think the overall transparency and model licensing agreements are fabulous ideas, and to look at more binding ways to include a tech transfer mechanism in a pandemic accord. But as mentioned, I think where the most leverage can be done is at this public funding part.
Thank you, Ella. Then there was a question to Jamie by Marcus Lowe. Would an entity such as C-TAP be more effective if it had greater technical capacity to assist companies in the practical implementation of tech transfer? Or should its role not go beyond facilitating tech transfer agreements? James, would you like to respond to that?
Well, I think it could be done either way. I think as you've seen, for example, with the medicines patent pool, they've signed licenses agreements that involve technology transfer, and that's not really what the capacity within the organization is. Not to help people know how to make drugs, but they've been able to get the agreements. That said, I think if you look at what's going on with the WHO messenger RNA hub and the vaccine hubs, the fact that the WHO has what comes across to people as some capacity in the technology transfer area seems to have been a positive in terms of the momentum and the attention and the seriousness at which people look to. So I'd have to say it would be a positive if the people working on this had more capacity themselves, and it would probably be something that would demonstrate some credibility within the community of people that were hanging on to technology. But I don't think it's absolutely necessary from a practical point of view. You can do it either way.
Okay, thanks, James, for elaborating on that. Then I also received a question that said, to what extent did C-TAP actively approach public research funders apart from the NIH? Maybe Ms. Dueñas, would you be able to reply to that question?
Yes, we had since the beginning of C-TAP, we engaged with the public health funders in order to see what were their policies, and it was not, of course, not only the NIH. With the NIH it was more a discussion on the licensing and their offers. But we discussed with the key funders, with the main key funders, and we are also planning to continue the discussions with them. And that is why we realized that to have a document with concrete, because everyone can say that they have access policies, right? But then how they apply in practice these kind of policies. So that is why we decided to do kind of a deep analysis of what are these access provisions that are needed or that we want to see in practice in their policies or in the agreements. So with this document, we're planning to continue the work with the funders in order to discuss about more concrete things.
Thank you, Ms. Dueñas. And then maybe a question from my side, maybe to all of you or whoever wants to answer it, is what do you think are the key lessons learned that should be implemented in a pandemic accord that the WHO member states are currently negotiating? Because some of you already touched upon the topic of the pandemic accord, but what is really the essence that should be included in a pandemic accord that also could be included from a legal perspective? Is there somebody who would take this question? James, please go ahead.
I think in some ways it would be easier in a pandemic treaty than in the COVID situation. In COVID, the pandemic came upon people very fast. And by the time people were focusing on some of the licensing issues, a certain amount of money had already been spent. And some companies thought they had a bigger head start than other companies in terms of having profitable products. Once people think they have an asset that could be worth a very, very large amount of wealth, it can be kind of difficult. But in the before things unfold, nobody really knows. It's sort of like the veil of ignorance. Nobody really knows who's going to have the best assets before the disease emerges. So right now, everyone's under this veil of ignorance. We don't really know whether the Germans, the Americans, the Chinese, the South Africans, the Indians, the Brazilians, we don't really know, the Iranians, we don't really know where the technology is going to come from. So in a way, it's easier to commit now to sharing. And so I think that's one thing. The other thing is that the agreement has to provide a pathway to sharing. They can't micromanage the exact nature of all the situations they're going to look at, but they have to have a pathway and a framework that in some cases mandates sharing in some cases, but in other areas it'll have to rely on incentives.
Thank you, James. And then another question to Ella and Julia. Quite some number of actors are involved in the setup of C-TAP. In your experience, is this beneficial, or would you consider otherwise? Ella?
I can give it a go, Julia.
Yeah.
Or perhaps Erika as well, being involved closely, can answer. But I would say it is beneficial because there's so much expertise. If I learned from, I spoke to several of them, and I learned that, for example, the government of Costa Rica is really taking it up closely. And I think that to get more partners and more actors involved, it means there's more support from multiple sides. There will be more outreach towards the the governments, towards the countries, but also from different platforms, for example, UNDP, etc. Julia, you also did the research, so I would like to hear your answer on this as well.
Yeah, thank you. This is a really great question as well, because it has come up often in interviews, and I think it is beneficial for the reasons that Ella has just mentioned. There is a lot of expertise out there, and that's also outside of the WHO, that can be very useful for, you know, the activities of C-TAP, and also in terms of advocating for this mechanism. There have also been remarks mentioned, and I think they also have their own standing, that it creates some kind of confusion as well. So especially the medicines patent pool hosts so much vast expertise and is contributing very strongly also to C-TAP. But that also means that from the outside, sometimes it's not quite clear who is in charge of what, and why is C-TAP necessary next to the medicines patent pool when the medicines patent pool itself is also closely involved. I think that there's a reason the medicines patent pool is closely involved as well. And I think once you read into the topic a little bit, of course, C-TAP's added value is also that it would provide vaccine technology transfer and facilitate that technology transfer. So I think on first glimpse, it can sometimes be a little bit confusing. I also think that in terms of the advisory groups that have been created, that sometimes I think it's a bit bureaucratic as well. I think that could have been a lighter structure that's a bit more flexible, and then in that case it would involve less actors. But I do think in general that it is beneficial, yes.
Thank you. Ella, Erika, do you want to come in as well? Yeah, please.
Yeah, sure. I think well, Julia and Ella already replied to the question, but I think also the involvement of other actors like member states, from WHO member states, and other UN organizations is very important, because what we see with this kind of voluntary mechanism is that we need more leverage for the negotiations, right? So if we have member states involved in the process and act more actively, for example, through these different kind of incentives that only the governments can provide at the national level, for example, in order to promote sharing, voluntary sharing, or so that adds a lot in the process of negotiation, in particular for this voluntary mechanism. But also, it is important to mention that that from WHO we see the voluntary mechanism as an alternative, right? It's part of the solution, but it's definitely not the only one. And I think you asked as well about what should be included in the INB. I think that was discussed already in the preliminary meetings or group discussions of the INB. We need to consider all the mechanisms that member states have in order to promote access. And this voluntary mechanism should be seen as one of the options, but not the only one, and that work in parallel with other options that are available.
Thank you, Erika. Then a question towards, I guess, Wemos. So that's Ella, maybe also Julia as the author. Did Wemos find in its interviews or its own analysis more concrete approaches of how to move from its useful aspirational goals, like mandating the use and support of global tech transfer mechanism, ensuring affordable pricing and out-licensing agreement, ensure access conditions in funding and procurement agreements, to concrete INB provisions? It would be helpful to have more insights on how to implement tactically these goals. So I guess I could summarize the question is, what would be concrete INB provisions here, translated from the report to the INB negotiations? And maybe this is also a question for one of the other respondents, because I do believe you have some insights in this as well.
Maybe I can start as well.
Yeah, Julia, please go ahead.
I understand the question correctly. So there are also recommendations directly in the report that we've targeted directly at the negotiating parties as well. And I think essentially what we see also is that there should be a provision that involves member states as well, that creates obligations for member states to support structures such as C-TAP when a pandemic arises. So I think it's already at the very beginning of member state involvement within a pandemic that this involvement should be targeted at creating global access and affordable access through the initiatives that are already there, such as C-TAP, the Medicines Patent Pool, but also through whichever initiative will be created or will be born out of that pandemic as well. So I think essentially, to summarize that, it's to create member state obligations also to support such an initiative already with the very first steps that they take within that pandemic.
Okay. Thank you, Julia. And I think, yes, Ellen, please go ahead.
Yeah, if I may, I think it would also be important to, well, first of all, I'd like to start by saying that the conceptual zero draft of the pandemic treaty I think is quite good and lays out really well the concerns that countries have brought to the table and has offers ample scope to regulate these things much better. And with regard to technology transfer, because I think that will be key to have good agreements on that, both on the financing of the innovation and of the transfer of the technology and of the IP needed for others to then produce the products that are needed. It might also be interesting to look at other agreements where such track transfer provisions have been made. We've published on our website a brief report, for example, on the Montreal Protocol, which is the agreement to help phase out substances that deplete the ozone layer, and that has a tech transfer fund. It has an agreement on sharing of the know-how of technologies needed for this, but also a financing mechanism to pay for it. And something like that might be very useful in a pandemic context as well.
Thank you, Ellen. Very clear. And with that final response, I would like to close off with a few take-home messages that I've noted down today. So the first one being that in order for technology transfer initiatives to become more successful, and whether this is C-TAP or any other, attaching conditions to government funding of research and development is really essential. Governments and the WHO should come up with model licensing agreements to facilitate this process. Second take-home message is that products that don't have any regulatory approval should also be considered to be taken up under C-TAP, as it's more likely for developers to contribute to C-TAP in the early development stages, rather than in a stage where the product has already been accepted onto the market. And the final take-home message that I would like to give to you is that including a technology transfer mechanism like C-TAP in the Pandemic Accord would be an important achievement in realizing equitable access to pharmaceutical products. So with those take-home messages, I would like to close the webinar. A big thank you to all our respondents and everyone who listened in. And I wish you all a great weekend. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tom. Have a good day.
You all.
Thank you, Wemos.
Bye.